My name's Sandra de la Loza, and I was born and raised in Los Angeles. I'm an artist, and I also teach mostly studio art classes. I teach in the public practice program at Otis, and I also teach in Chicano studies departments. In terms of social practice, it's a term that I don't necessarily wholly embrace. Like, I kind of see it as a phenomena that's, surfaced within a term that's surfaced within the last 5 or 6 years, towards maybe a way of approaching art that at times gets recognized by art institutions and at times not, and somehow kind of continues to persist. My work began about 20 years ago. I grew up in LA, went to Berkeley undergrad, and actually came home 3 weeks after the LA riots. And I came home very, very politicized. I went to school at a moment in which we had a huge economic downturn, proliferation of guns on the streets, and also a huge kind of crack epidemic. We also kind of have the beginnings of like a very intense kind of criminalization of so-called inner city youth that we really saw get instituted in the 1990s. Huge investment in what people call the prison industrial complex. So when I came back to LA, I came back very, very energized, and I wanted to kind of create change. And I met just amazing communities of like-minded people who, many were artists, many were students, many were community organizers. And for a large part of the 1990s, I participated in various forms of community spaces, community centers that were organized around art and culture. And I think one thing that I learned from that kind of time, which I kind of consider my art school out of art school, was, and one thing that we did and one thing that we played and experimented with was like the potential that we have to create our own structures for relating to each other, our own structures for learning, and the way that art might be a way to produce our own systems of knowledge. And so during that time, I think we really began to kind of politicize ourselves and began naming, before we had terms like prison industrial complex, before we had kind of the historic insight that LA was deindustrializing, how that was impacting working class communities. Through art and culture, we began to kind of reflect on changes and name those processes, and also kind of create alternatives. So, at that time, maybe the word art and activism, activist art might have been used. I understood like history as a public space, and I began to question how history was constructed. Especially in the first kind of iterations, I was really just looking at how history materializes in public space through the historic monument. And looking around and studying different, visiting different historic monuments in LA, it became very apparent that most of the monuments, they're really like pay homage to a military history. And it's a very kind of Eurocentric, very imperialistic narrative that's erected in public space. At the same time, growing up, as a working class Chicana in Los Angeles, I was also very aware of like the strong presence of Mexican history, Mexican labor, Mexican culture embedded in the history of Los Angeles, and how invisible it was and how unacknowledged that history was. And I was aware like how of the impact that kind of erasure definitely has on on ourselves, what happens when we internalize that, and how that impacts how we see ourselves and understand ourselves. So so with that, I began to decided to create my own historic plaques, and I would make these guerrilla plaques that commemorated erased moments in Alpine history, and I would insert them in public space. But in terms of doing this type of work, and I think as an artist, my some of the biggest challenges are to sustain the practice and find the support to continue to ask questions and continue to grow, and to have the time, resources, support to materialize ideas and to find methods of distributing the work.